Nice to see some old familiar faces here, and time has dealt kindly with some of you whom I have noticed. I hope you will be able to say the same for me if it's been a number of years since you've looked at me. It is never good to begin a presentation with an apology, they say, but I feel it incumbent upon me to apologize for the title of this seminar, which was given in some of the literature. Ask Professor Hodges about problem passages in the New Testament. That sounds like within the next 60 minutes that I will be able to solve all of the problems that you have anywhere in the New Testament, and I'm afraid that that is not the case. A close exegesis of that title would indicate it does not say, ask the Apostle Paul about problem passages or ask the angel Gabriel, both of whom we might need to do that much. And consequently, since it's me that's involved, I would like to set a much more limited objective. What I would really like to do this afternoon is to introduce you to a principle that some of us have been discussing in classes that I think is very useful in approaching a problem passage, and then I would like to try to illustrate it as it may be applied to a very significant problem passage and to a very significant book. I will need to crave the indulgence of some of those who have recently been with me, as a little of the terrain will be familiar to you. Please bear with me. We will ultimately get, hopefully for most of you, into something that we have not really discussed before. I want to begin by calling your attention to a book that I think is significant and has been making some waves on the campus in recent days, a book by E.B. Hirsch called Validity and Interpretation. I'm indebted to Dr. Edwin Bloom for calling my attention to this book. I have used it myself in class last semester, and I understand that Dr. Elliot Johnson is currently using it in an elective on the subject of hermeneutics. This, in my opinion, is a book that every one of our graduates really ought to read. The students who are here who have read it will be the first to tell you, however, that it is not particularly easygoing, and you may have to read and reread some of the sections in order to grasp the content, but I believe that you will find that the effort will be rewarding. Dr. Hirsch is actually a professor of English at the University of Virginia, and the book that he has written may be said to deal with the area of hermeneutics, but as a matter of fact, it is not a detailed presentation of a system of interpretation. I would rather describe it as a description of the way in which we understand either spoken or written materials. And as a theory of understanding, I think you will find it very, very useful. It would not be possible, obviously, to go into all the details of this book, and our purpose is not to review the book, but I would like to introduce you to one of the leading concepts of the book, and then attempt to apply this concept to a problem passage in the New Testament. This is Dr. Hirsch's concept of the intrinsic genre, which he defines as that sense of the whole by means of which an interpreter can correctly understand any part in its determinacy. I think I would like to leave out of consideration the last words here, in its determinacy, and try to explain to you what Hirsch has in mind. Hirsch points out that in all communication, when there is communication taking place, the hearer has already made at least a preliminary estimate of what the subject matter will contain. And his preliminary estimate of the subject matter under discussion will determine the way in which he understands the parts of the discussion. A simple illustration, I think, will suffice for this. We've all had an experience similar to this. Someone has begun to discuss with us a subject, and we think we are understanding the topic under discussion and the details of the discussion until we meet a detail in the discussion that does not conform really with our expectations. And then we say to the person, you're not talking about a restaurant, you're talking about a book, or something like that. And immediately we have shifted our conception of the entire subject under discussion, and very rapidly, if it is possible to do so, we go back and reorient ourselves to the parts of the discussion in such a way as to make them conform to this new intrinsic genre, this new generic conception that we have of the subject matter. Now, very much could be said about this, but that's about all that I want to say about it, except to contrast it really with what Hirsch also calls an extrinsic genre. If you are talking to me about a book, and I have the impression you are talking about a restaurant, my idea of a restaurant conversation is a wrong generic guess and is an extrinsic genre. An extrinsic genre is a wrong conception of what the subject matter is about. Hirsch also refers to what may be described as heuristic genres. And these are preliminary guesses that we make about what the speaker or writer intends to tell us. These are not necessarily wrong guesses. They may be initially very broad conceptions that we have of the person's subject matter. And as we listen to it, we may refine the subject matter increasingly. Now, there's another way of putting this. Some of you who have graduated and had me in class will probably find this slightly familiar. Very frequently, I've discussed the process of interpretation as a process going from synthesis to analysis, to synthesis to analysis, to synthesis. And the idea that we have in this is that you begin with a general idea about what your section is about, whether we're talking about a book, a paragraph, a verse, whatever it may be. Then, utilizing this initial idea about the content of the section under consideration, we move to the details and see if the details harmonize with our synthesis. Usually, this will lead to some narrowing or some redefining of the synthesis, and so we will return to the process of synthesis. Back to analysis to determine whether this new synthesis is more accurate. Back to synthesis, and so on. Now, from Hirsch's standpoint, each synthesis constitutes a generic guess about the content of the material. And each of the steps that we take in synthesis is ideally a refinement of this generic guess until hopefully we arrive at the true intrinsic genre, the real essence of the subject matter that is under consideration. Now, Hirsch points out that there is no systematic way of initiating generic guesses. We would like to be given a set of rules by which we may determine the intrinsic genre of a paragraph or a section or a book more or less infallibly. But from his standpoint of view, this is a matter of insight, and there's no way of regulating it. But there are ways of validating or checking the generic guess that we have made. And without going into all of the details, there are at least two things that we may expect a correct generic guess to do. First, we will expect it to create an array of submeanings that is highly suitable. And this array of submeanings can be seen to be usually superior to an array of submeanings produced by another generic guess. You may not grasp this all at the moment, but I will try to show it to you a little bit in our problem passage. But the point is that your generic guess governs your conception of all of the details of the passage that you are studying. And two opposite generic guesses may produce two differing constructions of the details, and it is possible, therefore, to compare the generic guesses themselves by comparing the explanation that they give to details. And that generic guess, which produces the most natural and approvable set of submeanings, is oftentimes the generic guess that is best. Another way of checking it is to say that a correct generic guess will usually make functional all of the elements of the passage. If after you've interpreted the passage you have no conception under this interpretation how certain parts of the passage fit together, if there are certain details of the passage that are not meaningful under your particular conception of the passage, that is probably an indication that your generic guess may either be wrong or it needs further definition. Now, what I have gone through took us many, many weeks to go through in some detail in the ACTS course, and I'm not expecting you to capture a great deal of this at this point. But keep these things in mind. I will recur to them in connection with the problem passage that I want to discuss. Let me say this by way of preface. Hirsch suggests to us that the differences in interpretation which we often meet in expert interpreters are very often traceable to a difference in their generic guess about the passage under consideration. All of us have had the exasperating experience of going to the commentators for the final word, perhaps, and discovering that commentator 1 gave us one final word and commentator 2 gave us another final word, and we wondered how in the world two men as competent as these commentators could come up with diverse explanations as they did. And as a rule, when men are equally competent and have studied the text thoroughly, differences of this type are traceable, Hirsch suggests, to a difference of generic conception. They are looking at the passage as a whole in a different way. This may almost seem to be a truism, but to articulate it, I think, is helpful. Now, the problem passage that I have chosen is from a book that I have never taught in class, and consequently, most of you have not heard me discuss it. I do see a few faces in the audience who have heard me discuss it, but most of you have not. Romans 10:9. Thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and believe in thine heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. I hope that most of you feel that this is a good, legitimate problem passage. I certainly do. As I read the commentaries on this, I get the impression that almost all of the commentators have made a substantially similar generic guess about this particular statement. And though we might articulate their precise generic guess somewhat differently in each case, it is safe to say that the usual generic guess that is made about Romans 10:9 is that it is a statement about eternal destiny. I think that would at least be included in the generic conception of almost every commentator that I am aware of. This is precisely the point at which a problem arises, in my judgment. First of all, we obviously have to ask, how does confession relate to Paul's exposition of justification by faith? If Paul in fact thought that confession was essential for a man to find acceptance before God, it is a little surprising, to say the least, that he has not introduced the subject before Romans 10. And we were under the impression when we read Romans 2, 3, 4, and 5 that faith was the only condition for justification. And we want to know, how does the subject of confession relate to Paul's total presentation? More particularly, how does it harmonize with the rest of the New Testament, from which it is natural to deduce that faith alone is the condition for salvation? As a matter of fact, I do not think we could produce another verse that could fall into the category of soteriology, which would specify confession as a condition for salvation. It would seem to me that the suggestion made by John Murray in the New International Commentary would probably be typical of the way in which most of us would attempt to grapple with this problem. He says that confession with the mouth is the evidence of the genuineness of faith and sustains to the same, that is to faith, the relation which good works sustain. This probably in our circles would be the most common explanation of this. A little consideration of this explanation, I think, however, will show that it really doesn't do the trick. First of all, the text says nothing at all about confession being an evidence of genuine faith. That is almost totally imported into the passage. What the text actually does is to set out confession as a corollary condition to salvation. If we were to carry Murray's suggestion one step further and say that this does in fact hold the same relationship to faith as good works hold to faith, we could then in theory produce a theological statement something like, if you shall live a good life and do good works and believe in your heart that God has raised Christ from the dead, you shall be saved. I'm presuming most of us would not be satisfied with a soteriological statement of that type. Some commentaries would be, and there are theologies that would find no difficulty in accommodating an idea like that, but the problem remains. On the face of it, the verse produces a conditional clause, and it has a dual protasis. Confession is not only part of the protasis, it is the first part of the protasis. One, therefore, is suspicious of the generic guesses that have been made about this passage in the light of the problems that I have produced here, and one wonders whether we are not on the wrong track totally by virtue of an erroneous generic guess. Is there any other possibility for interpreting this passage under a new generic conception of the passage? It is fairly evident that under the generic conception that we've just suggested, the key submeaning is the submeaning of sothese, which would be interpreted as eternal happiness and as approximately equal to justification. I say approximately because you might find some variation in the commentators, some thinking of sothese here as that which happens at the moment of justification, and others perhaps thinking of it as that which is related to our final destiny when we meet the Lord. But in any case, the substantial idea behind it is that it is virtually the same thing as what we mean by justification. If this submeaning were challenged, it would be evident that we were also challenging the total generic conception of the verse. And this is what I would like to do. I would like to raise a question about our total generic conception of the verse. We want to ask the question, how, in fact, does the Apostle Paul use the term salvation in the book of Romans? A concordance would be helpful in directing us to the places where the word occurs, and one of the places we would certainly light on, it seems to me, is Romans 5:9. Much more than, being justified now by his blood, we shall be saved through him from wrath. Now, I must say that this particular verse has created no problems for the generic conception that controls Romans 10 because of the generic conception that is also applied to this verse, in which it is usually understood to be saying that a man who is justified by faith will ultimately be saved. That is to say, when the Lord comes or when he dies. However, the verse does at least open up to us the possibility that we might think of justification and salvation as in some senses distinct. They are at least in some sense distinguished here. Much more than being justified now, we shall be saved. It is evident that whatever interpretation we give to sothei samatha, we shall have to think of it as something subsequent to justification. In this verse, however, the submeaning that controls the generic conception happens to be tes orges. If we understand the statement, we shall be saved through him from wrath, as meaning our ultimate and final salvation, the interpretation that will be necessitated for tes orges is the idea of eternal judgment. And it is within that framework that this verse, therefore, is understood by most of the commentators. Here I would like to raise a question about the correctness of the submeaning of tes orges, and therefore challenge the generic conception of Romans 5:9 that is common in the commentary tradition. If we wish to inquire where Paul first begins to discuss the subject of wrath, the answer to that will be in Romans 1:18. And in Romans 1:18 we discover that the wrath he is talking about is not future, but present. For the wrath of God is revealed, not shall be revealed, from heaven, against all impiety and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now it is very interesting here that insofar as I have sampled the commentaries on this, the generic conception that the commentators have of Romans 18, I think, is true to the passage. And their interpretation of the orge here is distinct from their interpretation of the orge here. They understand the orge of Romans 1:18 to be referring to the condition into which God has delivered man as described in the remainder of the chapter. And they call attention in particular to the threefold repetition of the statement, God gave them up, God gave them up, God gave them up. And the wrath that is being described, therefore, is God's anger with unrighteous man. And the result of this wrath is that man is turned over to the degradation, the control, and the dominion of sin. Now, however, a glance back at Romans 5:9 will show that we have an article here in front of the orges. In the immediate context of Romans 5, there is no reference to orge. And if the article here indicates previous reference, then the reference is to some orge previously discussed. Most commentators would find this orge in chapter 2, where they do interpret it of eternal judgment, but I think that is questionable as well. But it would be more natural, it seems to me, to think of the orge which, in effect, begins the argument of Romans. Consequently, I want to suggest to you that in Romans 5:9, we can understand the phrase tes orges as the orge theou of Romans 1:18. And therefore it is possible to understand the sophe samatha as deliverance from this orge. That is to say, we are talking here about deliverance from the dreadful condition under the dominion of sin, which is described in Romans 1. Let me try to illustrate this. Please forgive the unprofessional nature of the artwork on this. Hopefully this will get our point a little bit more clearly across. The statement of Romans 1 seems to be that heaven has revealed God's anger, specifically upon unrighteous men. As a result of God's anger on unrighteous men, these men sink down into the degradation of sin. And this experience of the degradation of sin is God's orge. It is the experience of God's orge. Now, the problem, therefore, that Romans confronts, I think, is the problem of how may we be saved from this dreadful condition into which the orge of God has cast sinful man. The problem must be approached from two aspects. First of all, you will notice, according to Romans 1:18, which we had on the overhead a moment ago, that God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all impiety and unrighteousness of men. Obviously, therefore, God's orge is against men who are unrighteous. This is the type of man who is cast into the slough of sin. The first step, therefore, must be to reconstitute man standing before God and to constitute him righteous. And the first movement, it seems to me, of the book of Romans is precisely here. How may unrighteous men attain a righteous standing before God? The answer to that, of course, is by justification. Now, if man is no longer unrighteous in God's sight, but rather righteous by faith, will he, must he, should he remain in the degradation of sin? The answer that the book of Romans gives to this is no. A righteous man ought to be delivered, and can be delivered, and will be delivered by the power of God from this degradation. And as a matter of fact, if we will return momentarily to Romans 5:9, which is a hinged verse, I think you will see that Romans 5:9 can be understood perfectly in this light. Much more then, being now justified by his blood, we are now constituted righteous. We shall be saved from this wrath, this degradation, through him. Now, you remember that Romans 5:10 proceeds and really repeats this contrast. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his, who can finish it? His life. You notice here he develops the contrast between reconciled by the death of his Son, saved by his life. This becomes a hinge by which we move into the Christian life section of Romans 5, 6, 7, and 8, where the key to the victorious Christian life is our link, our association with the life of Christ. So that we talk about being buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. We are dead to sin, but alive to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. You will notice that by changing our conception of the whole passage, we also change our whole thrust backward and forward through the book. This leads me to this additional suggestion. The entirety of the book of Romans can be viewed in a somewhat different light as a result of the suggestions that we have made. I am leaving out of consideration the first 15 verses, which are somewhat introductory. The theme verses will then be the theme verses that have long been recognized to be such, Romans 1, 16, and 17. But now listen closely to these theme verses, read in the light of the suggestions that we have made. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. That is, every believer can, through the power latent in the gospel, find the salvation from orge that he is going to talk about. Why is this possible? For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. All of the foundational elements of the argument are there. Because God in the gospel can constitute men righteous by faith, he can release his power in their life and save them from wrath. To put it another way, God sees men in this state that I've described a moment ago, unrighteous, therefore in bondage to sin. God comes to them with his righteousness, and they are invested with that righteousness on the principle of faith. And then God's power, working through the life of Christ, and through their link with that life, is the means by which they are delivered from his wrath, from the degradation of sin, and enabled to live victoriously in him. Now, coming back then, the theme verse gives, in essence, the argument of the book. The problem that is confronted is immediately confronted in chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven, and this is the condition of man, to which the gospel addresses itself. The solution is, I think, in 2:1 to 8:39, and has two easily identifiable parts. The first step in the solution is obviously that unrighteous man must be made righteous. This is justification, and the section is covered in 2:1 to 4:25. Chapter 5, as I understand it, has reached the end of the justification section and is the seed plot for the next major section. The hinge verses of chapter 5, verse 9 and 10 that we referred to a moment ago are in this section. And here we have laid down for us from 5:1 to 8:39 the basic principles of victorious Christian living. As I understand 9:1 to 11:36, Paul introduces this particular section of the epistle by way of motivation. He is going to discuss the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, the Jews being vessels of God's wrath, the Gentiles who have believed in Christ being vessels of his mercy. And if you'll remember the climax in chapter 11, he is blessing God for this mercy and for the wisdom that is latent in it. Then we come to what I call the application section. In the solution section, the basic general principles of Christian living are laid down, but no specifics of how this is worked out in particular situations are given, until we get to the application section in 12:1, where we talk about the good and acceptable and perfect will of God, and we begin to spell it out in terms of the use of gift, subjection to authorities, the question of doubtful things, and so on. And I would myself carry this section to 15:13, and the remainder, it seems to me, of the letter is in essence a conclusion. Now, there's one more thing that I want to present to you, but before I give you an opportunity to ask me questions about this, you will notice that for the moment, we started with Romans 10:9, and we questioned the generic conception of Romans 10:9. This led us back to Romans 5:9, and we also wound up questioning the generic conception of this verse. Ultimately, we questioned the generic conception of the entire book of Romans. And we want to suggest that by confronting problem passages where they were really details of the book, but somehow or other they seemed to clash with the structure of the book or the thought of the book as we felt we understood it elsewhere, we were led to re-examine the total generic conception of the book. May I suggest that this is a principle that is very, very useful in connection with approaching problem passages. One of the things that happens to us when we're working with a problem passage is that we restrict our area of thought within what I would call a certain generic conception, and all of our attempts to work with the passage are like juggling furniture in the same room. What we really perhaps needed to do was move all the furniture out of the room into another room, and there it would fit. At least that possibility has to be kept open. Now, we have said that in validating a generic conception, one of the things that validates such a conception is that it makes the details of the segment under consideration meaningful. And for this purpose, I'd like to come back to Romans 10, where we started. And forgive the massive amount of Greek, but all of you men, of course, can handle this readily. Verse 10 is the starting place of testing the generic conception that we had about verse 9. As we understood verse 9, therefore, the salvation that was being offered in verse 9 was, in fact, a salvation from orge. This is in a context relative to Israel, of course, but Israel in chapter 9 has been presented as an exhibition of God's orge, and unbelieving Israel as the vessels of God's orge. And Paul is therefore offering to Israel a deliverance from the orge under which they stand. Now, our generic conception of Romans 10:9, therefore, necessitates that we shall understand justification and salvation as somewhat distinct. Well, you notice that verse 10 confirms this. For with the heart he is believed for righteousness, and with the mouth he is confessed for salvation. The introduction here of the word dikaiosune obviously refers to the concept of justification by faith, and this is linked directly to what goes on in the heart. Whereas the salvation is linked to the accomplishment of the mouth. Now, it is interesting that the commentators apparently usually take verse 10 as a mere rhetorical repetition of verse 9. And they suggest that not much is to be made of the distinction between heart and mouth. They're two sides of the same coin. But it is obvious that if we have a distinction in our mind from verse 9, that verse 10 is luminous in the light of this distinction. If, in fact, the book of Romans distinguishes between justification and salvation, justification being that which accords us our righteous standing before God's salvation, that which delivers us from God's wrath. Now, he continues apparently with the consideration of the subject of confession, because the next verse says, the Scripture says, everyone who believes on him shall not be ashamed. A person who has exercised faith in Christ ought to have no embarrassment about acknowledging that faith. Why ought he not to be ashamed? Verse 12, for there is no difference between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord over all is rich unto all those who call upon him, who invoke him. And then he quotes from the Old Testament, for everyone who invokes the name of the Lord shall be saved. You'll notice the reappearance here of sophesetai, which we pick up from here. Only now the word is not homologeo, but epikalesetai. We would suggest here that he's still on the theme of confession, but elaborating this theme. The verb epikaleo, in some places in the New Testament, seems to be a way of identifying Christians who invoke the aid of God and are therefore publicly associated with the name of Christ. We would think here of Acts 9:14 and 9:21, 1 Corinthians 1:2. It seems almost to be a way of designating Christians who are publicly identified as such. Acts 9 is particularly illuminating in this respect because here Paul goes to Damascus to bind all of those who call upon this name. It is obvious that if he's going to arrest Christians, he is going to arrest Christians who are Christians in public, Christians who have openly acknowledged this name and who invoke the aid and assistance of the Lord. So what he seems to be saying through here, and what I think he means by confession, is not merely a one-time confession necessarily, but that public stance in which we appeal to God and to Christ as Lord for the help that we need. You will notice, therefore, that this makes sense out of his emphasis upon believing that God hath raised him from the dead, because here we're talking about the salvation that we get by linking ourselves with the risen life of the risen Lord. Now, this approach to it, I think, is further confirmed by a series of statements he makes in verses 14 and 15. How shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? How shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? How shall they hear without one who preaches, and how shall they preach except they be sent? Working from the bottom up, it is evident that we have a series of steps. First of all, you have to send a man before he preaches. And a man has to preach before anybody can hear. And an individual has to hear before he can believe. But the next step is the one we haven't taken. A person has to believe before he can call on the name of the Lord. And I suggest that these verses show us just exactly what verse 10 shows us. These are not two sides of the same coin. They are successive steps. Faith is the first step. The second step is confession, or invocation of the name of the Lord, dependence upon the name of the Lord, publicly acknowledged and called upon. And so what he is saying is, if you're going to avail yourself publicly, openly of the power of the risen Lord, you must first obviously believe in him. And it seems to me, at least, that in the light of this particular approach to it, the passage ceases to be a soteriological problem to us. Paul is, in fact, in this passage still maintaining what he maintained in the opening verses and chapters of the book, that righteousness comes by faith. And he does not link confession with the obtaining of righteousness. Verse 10 makes that very clear. He does link confession with the obtaining of salvation, but if salvation is not synonymous with the obtaining of righteousness, no soteriological problem is raised by this. So I use this as an illustration of something that might be practical by way of a general principle for you. Try to get yourself out of what I would call the generic rut if you are really stuck with a passage. Try a totally fresh idea. In my own experience of studying the book of Romans, it happened very much like I have described to you. I really began to get my first insights into the structure of Romans from studying verses 9 and 10 of chapter 10. And the moment I noticed that Paul was in fact drawing an apparent distinction here, then I was able to make the connection with other places in the epistle where he draws this distinction, notably 5, 9, and 10, where the distinction also emerges, and carry that back to the opening chapter of the book. And it does appear to me as if this will give an acceptable analysis to the structure of the book, as well as solve some of the details within it. But notice that the conception of the book as a whole, the intrinsic genre of the whole book, if you will, is very influential in our conception of the individual parts. What is wrong, I think, with the standard intrinsic genres of the book of Romans is simply this: they cannot grapple with this type of detail within the book, at least not adequately. They do grapple with it. And I would suggest that whenever a conception of a book cannot adequately come to terms with details, that we ought to re-examine our total conception and see if we can get a conception that is able to come to terms with details. Now, I welcome your questions for the minutes that remain. Dan?
One of my problems was in your outline, I thought one of that section on motivation, 9 through 11, was not dealing with the details of that particular passage. Now, that's not crucial to what you just said about 10:9. I think that was, I can't debate with that.
Well, what I have not attempted, in this presentation to deal with the details of this section. I feel like we could deal with it, but here I have to be satisfied to give you my intrinsic genre of this section. What I really want to say is that he is discussing in considerable detail what is true in Israel's relationship right now with God and how this relates to the Gentiles. Now, he goes into great detail with this. In other words, we must understand what God is doing with Israel if we are to understand what God is doing with us right now. But you will recall that when we get to the end of chapter 11, we really come to a warning section for Gentiles in connection with the figure of the olive tree. And Gentiles are warned not to be high-minded, but in fact to be appreciative of this. And he draws the whole thing to more or less to a conclusion by saying, they are enemies for your sakes on account of the gospel, you say, and that mercy has come to you. And then you remember the doxology, oh, the depths of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out, and so on. And then we come to Romans 12:1. I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. He is now appealing to what he has discussed in the previous section. In the light of the fall of Israel, God's mercy in a very special way has gone out to Gentiles. Gentiles are to appreciate their present relationship to God as objects of mercy. And in the light of these mercies, they are to live the life that Paul has been explaining. I personally regard Romans 12:1 and 2 as, in some senses, a recapitulation of the truth of Romans 6, 7, and 8. And that the yielding of the body is what he's talking about in Romans 6, where he says we are to take the members of our body and to yield them as instruments of righteousness to God. The physical body, therefore, being made the vehicle for the will of God, for the expression of the will of God. And this is done only as there is a transforming work of the Spirit going on within us. And that transforming work of the Spirit allows us to discern, dokimazo, the good and acceptable and perfect will of God, which is then explained. But the reason I refer to this section is because the appeal is to the mercies of God, which he has been discussing in the previous section. Now, as far back as Romans 9, he has laid out, I think, his basic premises. God, what if God, in his sovereignty, chooses to manifest his wrath upon those who are the vessels of wrath, that's Israel in particular in this context, and to have mercy upon the vessels of mercy? So his conception is still this idea of orge, you see. Israel now the prime example of orge. While I'm on this, one little point that I forgot to indicate to you, you remember way back in the 118 verse, God's orge is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of men who katekanton, who restrain the truth in unrighteousness. They are unrighteous and they suppress the truth in this context of nature, you see. But they are holding it down. They refuse to acknowledge it or conform to it. Thus, it becomes logical for us to associate acknowledgement of the truth, confession of the truth, with deliverance from orge. Now, Israel is the supreme example of a nation seeking to suppress the truth, you see. Therefore, they fall under the orge of God. Therefore, they cannot escape that orge until they are not only prepared to believe in their hearts, but to confess with their mouth. And thus, this is the message to Israel. If God's wrath against Israel is to be lifted, it must be by this means. But all of these thoughts are developed in this section. Yes, sir.
How unique is this interpretation of that? Are there other commentators that...
I have not been able to find them, and I have looked. And all I can say is that not very many people in this room are surprised to hear me come up with an absolutely unique interpretation. And really what I was trying to point out here, I guess, was this, that the commentary tradition, as I see it, has a certain intrinsic genre conception, not only of the particular problem passage that I discussed, but of Romans as a whole. What I am doing is suggesting a new genre conception, which I have not located as yet in a commentary. So I have to say that, yes, as far as I know, this is not supported in literature. Don?
You come out with basically the same thing in that particular passage. That is, confession is basically post-salvation, and is an evidence somewhat of justification. But all you've done is change the conception of salvation.
Yes, I have changed the conception of salvation, but it seems to me that that is a substantial change of conception.
No, but I mean, you still have the same thing. The basic problem is with the concept of salvation in the verse is not the problem with the relationship of justification and confession.
No, that's true. Although, as you can see from Murray's attempt to harmonize this, the harmonization that he makes on the basis of his generic conception raises problems. No, I have not, I have still stayed in the bailiwick of sound doctrine as far as the relationship of confession to salvation is concerned. But I have explained salvation differently. I do think, though, Don, that my total generic conception of the book is not that different in the final analysis from the general generic conceptions of the book as a whole. Because most commentators understand the book as discussing Christian living. And they don't put the pieces together like I do. And their definition of salvation within the book of Romans is not the same as my definition. But our generic conceptions are close enough to each other so that large segments of the book of Romans are unaffected, it seems to me, in interpretation by this change that I've made.
That was my point. You really hadn't changed all that much, and you got away from his basic problem.
Yes, yeah, I think that's true. And, I read the justification sections the same way that everybody reads them. But when I come to 5, 9, and 10, I read those verses differently. I structure the book just a little bit differently because I see these verses as hinges. Apparently, a number of your commentators see the division at 12. But I want to make the division earlier, but you can see that's only a relatively minor adjustment. I want to begin at 5:1 because I think that's a seed plot for the rest of the chapters 6 through 8. I think there's validity in what you're saying, all right. John?
In your understanding of the book this way, you would see Paul as being in a regenerate state in chapter 7, for example.
Yes.
Now, how would you support that with this kind of...
Well, the considerations that would dictate that understanding of Romans 7, it would seem to me, would be more closely developed by a study of 6 and 8, which I haven't really touched on here. One of the leading motifs in 6 and 8 is the life-death motif. And as I understand chapter 8, he is talking about, he says, if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, and the spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he shall also quicken your mortal bodies by his spirit that dwelleth in you. Now here it seems to me he is talking about Christian experience right here and now, not in the future. He is saying, really, looked at in the abstract, the Christian is in a dead body. But the spirit that raised up Christ is able to make that body alive by making it the vehicle for the will of God. So if you live after the flesh, you shall die. But if you, through the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. Experientially, you will have the experience of the life of God. Now, this life-death motif is in Romans 7. So, for example, when he comes to the end of the chapter, he says, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? But that is understood in the light of the fact that if Christ is in us, the body is dead because of sin. The spirit is life because of righteousness. It seems to me it is very difficult to understand his phrase also in Romans 7, I was alive without the law once, but the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. What does that mean if he's talking about his unsaved state? How could he have been alive without the law? Well, it's a little difficult to conceive of that. But if we are talking about this experience of the life of God in the individual, then he is saying, I was doing fine as a Christian until I was confronted by a commandment that focused me upon my sin, and the sin took advantage of that focusing and robbed me of this experience. Very much like I usually illustrate this, the newly saved Christian who is living in the full flush of his Christian experience and enjoying the Lord, really alive, you might say, in the Lord. And all of a sudden somebody comes to him and says, you know you ought not to smoke. That is not a good parallel with Romans 7 because the command in Romans 7 was, thou shalt not covet. I'm using this as an illustration. And all of a sudden, his whole orientation is to, thou shalt not smoke. And he begins to think, I never thought of that as a sin, but smoking is nice and I'd hate to give it up. And pretty soon, he has lost the vitality of his experience. He is focused on a negative. He is defeated by sin in connection with that negative. And this is the experience in miniature of the person who tries to live under the law. And what Paul really does in Romans 8 is get the person refocused on the things of the Spirit. To be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. The man must reorient himself to the things of the Spirit which give him this vitality and produce this resurrection response. Now, what my answer to your question is rather elaborated, but the reason I'm answering it this way is it seems to me, once again, that it is the understanding of the whole that interprets the parts. So if we get a conception of the life-death motif that is running through 6, 7, and 8, we will, I think, be able to grapple with the problem of 7 in the light of this life-death motif. And I think that helps to solve the problem. What is the experience described in Romans 7? Well, it is really tangent to directly the Christian experience that is described in 6 and 8. Heberling.
Have you followed through on your definition of salvation? Any other
To the best, yes, I've begun some thinking about this, and to the best of my knowledge, Paul doesn't use the term soteria quite this way anywhere else. By the way, may I point out, as the questions come, things occur to me that might be said. From 1:16, where we have, it is the power of God unto salvation. Where do you think the next reference to salvation in Romans is? The next reference to salvation. 5:9. So in the whole justification section, there is no reference to salvation. It is not until justification is settled that the theme of salvation reemerges. Now, what I would say here, Mr. Heberling, is that every book of the New Testament and every book of an individual writer has to be approached, I think, on its own terms. And I think that Paul has deliberately reserved the term salvation for this particular facet of our experience. And that is why, though he might have been perfectly capable of using it in the section on justification, he did not use it there, because he wishes, for purposes of his exposition in Romans, to distinguish the two. Now, in other passages where he has other purposes, he may use salvation and does use salvation in a different sense. And I understand Ephesians 2 differently than I've understood Romans 5:9. But each book has to be analyzed, I think, on its own basis. Right in back of John, we'll get this question back here.
Explain again what you mean by salvation, from wrath, and sanctification, or cold life.
Yes, I'll try to. By the concept of wrath here, I have in mind the condition described in Romans 1, where men are turned over to a reprobate mind, to dishonoring passions, and all of these things, so that we have a Skid Row description of mankind, if you want to put it that way. All right, that's the basic problem, as I say. How can a man get out from under this kind of a condition? The gospel meets him, enslaved to sin, under the orge of God. How can he get out from under? That is the basic problem posed, it seems to me, by Romans. First of all, he must be justified. As long as he is unrighteous in God's sight, there's no escape from this. But once he is justified, it is possible to escape. And then the question is, how can I escape the control of sin in my Christian life? Assuming I am a justified person who has believed in his heart on Christ, how can I get victory over sin? This is, of course, the problem that every Christian faces. Could hardly be a more practical problem. And his answer to that is, through the life of the living Lord. We are saved by his life. And what he then goes on to explain is that we have been brought into union with the life of Christ. And by the power of the Spirit, that life can be lived out through these otherwise dead bodies of ours. So that a body that is in and of itself the seat of sin can become an instrument for the vital living of the life of God. And this is, of course, Romans 12:1, too, that we present our bodies a living sacrifice, you see. The body that is intrinsically dead now becomes, in the process of obedience to God, a living thing given to him. But in essence, we would say that it is the life of Christ made vital in our experience by the work of the Spirit. Now, I relate this to the subject of confession in this way. The man who confesses Christ is a man who openly depends upon the one Lord over Jew and Gentile. That is, he draws his dependence openly and publicly upon this Lord. Another way of saying this is, nobody will live a victorious Christian life in secret. It is always lived out in the open. And therefore confession, in the sense that I've described it, is essential, because it is an open acknowledgement of our link to the Lord of heaven, whom God has raised from the dead, and our dependence upon his life for my life.
Wrath, what?
Wrath in that context would mean the control of sin, to which God turns men over. I might say this, too, that as far as I know, nowhere in the New Testament is there a clear-cut passage where orge refers to eternal judgment. I personally believe that all of the passages that deal with orge refer to some expression of temporal judgment. A number of these relate to the tribulation period, which is a temporal expression of God's displeasure with sin. But there's also a contemporary displeasure in the degradation into which men are brought. We are under instructions to cut this off immediately at 4:30. And so I think I would like to dismiss you. I will hang around and talk with any of you that would like to talk about it.